my presentation on sculpture and material exploration. Starting off with paper and cardboard exploration, I first focused on tearing as my first form, tearing both sides of the paper, curling the edges around my finger, and then uncoiling the coils to act as legs for the piece. I also curled the arms diagonally inward to create a more fluid piece. When it came to folding, I created a pleating pattern going in a circular direction, making sure to keep the center of my paper loose to allow more movement, creating these shapes. Twisting and scrunching pieces of paper together, I twisted the paper in both directions around my hands and then decided to add feet to the bottom to allow the structure to stand. For the scrunching, I took the paper in one of my hands and crunched it in one inward motion. From there, I was able to get this shape, which kind of looks like it's crawling forward because of the different ridges coming upward. This slide here shows all 4 experiments together. Something that I had to make sure to focus on was balance, making sure one side wasn't too heavy on the other or else it would tip over. Playing with cardboard, I decided to collect and experiment with all cardboard pieces by ripping, cutting, and getting fuzzy edges from the small tears in the paper. The scissors allowed for a straight edge and making geometric shapes. I also used scissors to cut the ends closely together, create a frayed piece with more of a feathered edge. And then I also peeled back the thicker cardboard to reveal the fluted layer. Before I moved forward, I also decided to test glue, Mod Podge being the best result for me because it actually managed to keep the pieces of cardboard attached while I was able to move around them. The Gorilla Glue and Elmer's Glue wanted to move off of the cardboard and not stick. I also managed to have a reaction to the Gorilla Glue. Gloves did not work with Gorilla Glue either because then it made my gloves stick together. So as an artist, the Mod Podge was a better choice for me. When creating a structure that stands on its own, I made sure to keep in mind to use the thicker cardboard for the base, because if I used something thicker up top, then the entire piece would fall over. Working on the shell of the piece, I glued the thick cardboard, then thin cardboard, finally with paper applied at top. I made sure to apply the glue to the paper only at the section that was attaching the glue, because if it was added to the top, then the heaviness of the glue would have it tip forward. The process for this was a little bit more different from forming a singular material because I had allowed the pieces time to dry and make sure they all fit together well enough without falling apart. For this next section of paper and cardboard building, I focused on changing materials. The first step of building the structure as tall as I could go was preparing the lighter cardboard pieces in triangular shapes and then working upward, having slits hold them together and using glue as caulking to keep the piece up. When the piece grew too big and was moving outward in opposite directions, I added a rectangular piece attaching the top 2 to focus the momentum on coming inward. I then continued to build upward until I wasn't able to build up anymore because of the piece was leaning. Moving on to building without using glue, I continued to use a puzzle piecing method, cutting slits within the cardboard. The slits were pushed together, and then I continued to add them as the piece built up. Experimenting with holes and punching the cardboard, I poked 2 holes in opposite directions of the cardboard pieces, and then threaded a thin cardboard piece between the holes, attaching them together like a curtain rod. Then I knotted a paper around the pole and allowed the momentum and lightness of the top of the paper versus the heavier knot at the bottom to allow it to levitate upward. For my singular cardboard remake, I decided to use the flutedness of the thick cardboard underneath. Peeling up pieces with an X-Acto knife and scissors, I also managed to create a door with one side still attached to the cardboard to create an invisible hinge. I cut the roof with scissors and folded that forward, thread them through slits just to keep the roof forward. I had the option to use glue, tape, or another adhesive, but I wanted to keep the raw material, so this house is fully made from just the cardboard and not gluing it together. When transforming the surface with the tempera paint cake, I chose to use the first cardboard structures that I created, taking into consideration the shape of the objects before adding paint and creating a textured element. I chose the piece on the left because of the different pieces reminded me of a carnival. I chose to use shapes within my colors to continue playing on with the funness of it. The other piece, which is leaning, I chose to resemble more of a rainbow, each piece individually painted a different color, heading back to it. For my paper mache material, I decided to use Mod Podge, wheat, and water, making sure to experiment also with the paper I had beforehand, because I knew that once I got started, it would be very messy. The rolls at the top of the paper mache liquid for this form was fully dipped into the water. I squeegeed off the excess. For the other parts, first building up the form, I used a singular paintbrush to apply with grace where the paper mache liquid would go. The structure was able to stand up on its own in an upright position and flipped up or down. Through this project too, I was also able to scrunch, roll into balls, knot, tie, and play around with what the paper mache liquid also did on top. To help with its form, I did apply a layer of rubber bands around it, but after the cup was removed, the structure was able to stand on its own in 2 different directions. Paper mache construction amateur. I gathered boxes, heat-resistant cardboard that was on a coffee mug, water bottles, and I taped all of them together to get a base form. For the amateur I rolled together newspaper and painter's tape to also create the base form. When applying the paper mache on top, I used the same technique. I used multiple different layers going in various different directions to really allow the paper mache to form together. For this piece, I also included, for the triangular shape, to paint with acrylic. Because the acrylic paint was not as heavily water-based as the tempera paint, it did not have a peeling effect once the paper mache was set. I added small embellishments also to a paper mache bowl that I used. I had raised edges from the squeegeeing of strips. I added beads to the inside, and I applied string in a spiral direction from the bottom going upwards, sealing it with a layer of tissue paper. Towards the end, I also made sure to use colored tissue paper. The only struggle with specifically using tissue paper I found was if my mixture was more water-based, then the tissue paper would rip easily. Plaster casting forms. I used more of my plaster mixture to put on objects on the top, and I messed around with what was going on. I squeegeed the plaster as well, using the same format that I did as the paper mache. For plaster wrapping forms, I began assembling different pieces of cloth and preparing them before I got my hands covered in plaster, using different rips, shapes, and everything, allowing them to take form of the cup. I did the same thing with the bowl, as well as weaving them together. Plaster casting forms. I used more of my plaster casting mix at the bottom of the bowl, added found objects on top, creating a mosaic. I then went ahead and used clay, adding a slab at the bottom of another bowl, pressing different objects into it, such as coins, soda tabs, paintbrushes, a lighter, skull-shaped crystal, and left impressions. I also added a ring around the edge of the clay to prevent the plaster from going into unwanted areas. Once the plaster had set for 12 hours, making sure that they were hard and set, I removed them from the pieces. Surface treatments. I added back into the pleated fabric with tempera paint. I wanted to experiment how the watery tempera would act with the form. The water wasn't as bad because I was able to control what water was added to the weaved fabric, so it didn't show up as much of a problem as I would have expected. Below are images that I have already discussed, just because it was an easier correlation to link them right away. Found objects transforming a book. At first I wanted to take away books creating taking away paper to create a tree form. I needed to think of what I wanted to have my book be first, before I took away too much paper or did something that I would regret to do. I first started by applying glue to the pieces that I wanted to stick together, then went in with scissors, took away and created negative space of the tree, added the pieces that I took away back, wrapped it with a paper mache piece to keep the paper together, as well as wrapping string around it to create more of a 3D element. I then went in with Mod Podge again and applied glue and folded paper to create the leaves of the tree. For the grass, I went in finally just with my hands and ripped the paper, creating different layers, and then folded and scrunched the layers up, creating that 3D element. When creating my standing structure, I thought about the objects I had around me and what I should use. I grabbed my nicer clothing and placed them on a pile of my chair, placed hangers for my wardrobe, and allowing the eye to travel up to my sweatshirt. This piece representing the moments in my life where, as a woman, I try to dress nicer, try on 1,000 outfits before I leave, but because of being weighed down by some of my femininity, I chose to sit back and be more comfortable just wearing a sweatshirt during days. Solid object that I chose to build off of was my computer. I took that digital element compared to a DVD as well as a book, sketchbook, scrunchy flip-flops, just to invoke the back and forth of technology and being outside of nature. Then when it came to altering other objects, I took a spare shirt that I had and covered it in glue, plaster, and string, other materials that I used for this project, including my bag of trash and scrap pieces I glued together. I wanted to create the process of me making this entire experiment into my piece, so this is a representational of me. Working with clay. Experimenting with clay, I took a German brand as well as Crayola clay and worked with creating a bunch of forms by pinching, rolling, twisting, patting, pounding, and putting holes with pencils, needles, and crayons. For solid modeling, I decided to make a series of figures doing yoga. First, starting off by making each individual body part together so that no piece would look too different. Once all of the figures were together, I added hair and ears and other accessories. For pinch potting, I took a ball of clay, pressed my thumb in the center, and applied pressure to the inside and outside of the walls of the ball of clay, pushing the clay in between my fingers, rotating the pot to make sure that it was similar on each side. I then expanded on this, creating a taller structure and also creating a heart by moving my fingers in opposite directions and making sure to thin out the walls. For coiling, I took chunks of the clay and rolled it between my palm and the edge of the table, creating long coils about a half an inch thick. From that point, I used water to score and attach the pieces of clay together, making sure the coils stayed upright. I went in with my fingers and scissors to continue to add texture. For the handle on the vase, I used another coil but flattened it back down and rolled the edges as well as the scoring and watering technique to put them together. To make a slab building, I took one big ball of clay and rolled it out with a rolling pin. I cut the edges with scissors, making a square for the tile. I then went back in with a thin needle, paintbrush, and an X-Acto knife to score and inlay the carving texture of the tree. I also added a coil frame to the sides of it, adding balls to the tree and twisting little worms to the edges. I set this piece on my mantle to allow gravity to sit and bend the shape. The last part of this section was to experiment with different colored modeling clay, which were colored glitter magic modeling clay, and which I used to make an octopus. And I also used different forms of pastel polymer clay to marble different colors together by twisting and kneading them into the tree leaves. The top was also scored together with the trunk of the tree. I created the patterning in the trunk of the tree with a needle, creating that texture. And then to create the creases in the fish and tree, I pinched the forms just using my fingers. This is built on of my surface color, of adding acrylic paint. There were many different types of effects that I wanted to achieve. That adding texture was by stamping, adding color, painting different depths and dimensions from pressure different objects into the clay. I can use this for my students for clay as early ages as stamping things and learning about texture and just everything in general and how that different objects interact with the world and the clay. And then I can build up making pinch pots for them to understand the basics foundation of clay. And for an older audience, I can focus on building up larger forms and working on solid builds. Everything that I did today was a great experience, building up my knowledge and applying it for my students. The more simpler forms, of course, I would use for more of an elementary age, building up on their skills on how to properly use the materials. And then when I'm developing this with older children, I'm going to use the knowledge they have already learned and elaborate bigger on it and have them go bigger and into deeper depth and detail. Thank you for being with me on this journey. I hope you all have a great day.